Some doors are meant to stay locked. Some secrets buried deep in family estates should never see the light of day. But when 17-year-old Charlotte Morrison found herself trapped in her grandfather's forbidden study with something that defied every law of nature, she discovered that some terrors don't wait for permission to emerge. What started as a curious teenager's innocent exploration of a dusty old room would become a race against time, where a single desperate scream would shatter the silence of Blackwood Manor forever. Behind that heavy oak door lay not just forgotten family heirlooms, but a darkness so profound that even the estate's most hardened security guard would risk everything to break down barriers that had protected the world for generations. This is the true account of the night Charlotte Morrison learned that some family legacies are better left undiscovered, and that sometimes the most frightening monsters are the ones that have been patiently waiting in the shadows of our own homes. Charlotte Morrison had always been drawn to mysteries, but she never imagined that the biggest one would be hiding just 3 doors down from her childhood bedroom. The 17-year-old had spent countless summers at her grandfather's sprawling estate, Blackwood Manor, yet one room had always remained off-limits. Her grandfather, Edgar Morrison, a man whose stern demeanor commanded respect from everyone in their small English countryside town, had made it crystal clear that the study at the end of the West Wing was absolutely forbidden. "Some doors are locked for good reasons, Charlotte," he had told her when she was just 8 years old, his weathered hands gripping her shoulders with surprising gentleness. "Promise me you'll never try to enter that room." She had promised, of course, the way children do when faced with adult authority. But promises made by 8-year-olds rarely survive the curiosity of teenagers. The opportunity finally presented itself on a rain-soaked October evening. Edgar had traveled to London for urgent business matters, leaving Charlotte alone with the estate's small staff. Mrs. Hartwell, the elderly housekeeper, had retired early with one of her frequent headaches. James Richardson, the night security guard, was making his rounds of the expansive grounds, his heavy footsteps echoing through the manor's long corridors every hour on the hour. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Charlotte slipped out of her room just after midnight, her bare feet silent against the cold marble floors. The West Wing felt different in the darkness, older, somehow heavier with secrets. Ancient portraits of long-dead Morrison ancestors seemed to watch her progress with disapproving eyes, their oil-painted faces flickering in the dim light of her phone's flashlight. The manor had been in her family for over 200 years, built by her great-great-grandfather who had made his fortune in mysterious circumstances that family members spoke about only in hushed whispers. The study door stood at the end of the corridor like a silent sentinel. Unlike the other doors in the manor, this one was made of heavy black oak, reinforced with iron bands that had turned green with age. An ornate brass lock, larger and more complex than anything Charlotte had ever seen, held the door firmly shut. She had expected this, of course. What she hadn't expected was the strange sensation that seemed to emanate from behind the door itself, a subtle vibration, almost like a heartbeat, that she could feel through the soles of her feet. For several minutes, Charlotte simply stood there, her hand hovering inches from the dark wood. The rational part of her mind urged her to turn around, to return to her room, and forget about the study forever. But curiosity had always been her weakness, and the pull she felt toward whatever lay beyond that door was stronger than any rational thought. The lock proved to be less of an obstacle than she had anticipated. Charlotte had always been mechanically inclined, a trait that had both impressed and exasperated her grandfather. Armed with a set of makeshift lockpicks fashioned from hairpins and a small flashlight, she worked methodically on the ancient mechanism. The lock was old, its internal mechanisms worn smooth by decades of use, and after 20 minutes of careful manipulation, she was rewarded with the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. The door swung open with surprising ease, revealing a room that defied every expectation Charlotte had formed over the years. Instead of the dusty, neglected space she had imagined, the study was immaculately maintained. Rich burgundy curtains hung from tall windows, and shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that seemed to glow with an inner light. An enormous desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers, maps, and strange instruments that belonged in a museum rather than a private study. But it was the walls themselves that captured Charlotte's attention. Between the bookcases, the dark paneling was covered with what appeared to be photographs, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn maps connected by colored string, creating an elaborate web of information that stretched across the entire room. As Charlotte moved closer, her flashlight revealed that the images were not ordinary family photographs or newspaper articles about local events. Instead, they depicted scenes that made her stomach turn. Newspaper headlines about mysterious disappearances dating back decades, photographs of people who had seemingly vanished without a trace, and handwritten notes in her grandfather's distinctive script that spoke of contained incidents and necessary sacrifices. The dates on the materials spanned nearly 50 years, beginning in the 1970s and continuing right up to the present day. Charlotte recognized some of the names from local news reports: missing hikers, tourists who had never returned from visits to the area, even locals who had simply walked out of their homes one day and never come back. According to the official reports, these were isolated incidents, unfortunate but explainable disappearances in an area known for its treacherous terrain and unpredictable weather. But the materials on the walls told a very different story. Her grandfather's notes, written in multiple notebooks that lay open on the desk, spoke of something called the feeding, events that occurred with disturbing regularity every few months. The entries were clinical in their detail, describing locations, times, and what Edgar referred to as acceptable losses. Charlotte's hands shook as she read entry after entry, each one documenting what appeared to be the deliberate sacrifice of human beings to something that Edgar never directly named, referring to it only as the Guardian or the Ancient Hunger. The most recent entry was dated just 3 days ago, while Charlotte had been away at school. According to Edgar's notes, a young backpacker named David Chen had been selected during his visit to the nearby village. The entry described his route through the local hiking trails with the precision of a military operation, including specific times and locations where he would encounter what Edgar called the influence. The final line of the entry was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. Subject successfully delivered. Guardian satisfied for approximately 73 days. Charlotte sank into the leather chair behind the desk, her mind struggling to process what she was reading. Her grandfather, the man who had taught her to ride horses and had patiently helped her with her mathematics homework, was apparently orchestrating the disappearance of innocent people. The evidence was overwhelming. Maps marked with locations where people had vanished, detailed profiles of potential victims, and most damning of all, what appeared to be a ledger tracking the delivery schedule stretching back decades. As she continued to explore the room, Charlotte discovered that the study contained far more than just documentation of her grandfather's activities. Hidden behind a false panel in one of the bookcases was a collection of artifacts that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent energy. Ancient stone tablets covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, metal objects whose purpose she couldn't determine but which made her skin crawl when she touched them, and photographs that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. The centerpiece of this hidden collection was a large, ornate mirror that stood nearly 7 feet tall. Its surface wasn't reflective in any normal sense. Instead of showing Charlotte's reflection, it displayed what appeared to be a swirling darkness that seemed to have depth and movement. As she stared into it, mesmerized despite herself, she began to see shapes forming in the darkness. At first, they were abstract patterns that might have been tricks of the light. But gradually they resolved into forms that were unmistakably organic: tentacles, eyes, and things that might have been mouths, all writhing together in a dance of predatory hunger. The mirror's surface began to ripple like water, and Charlotte realized with growing horror that whatever was on the other side was becoming aware of her presence. The shapes in the darkness moved with increasing agitation, and she could swear she heard sounds emanating from within the mirror, a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to resonate in her bones, punctuated by what sounded disturbingly like whispers in a language she didn't recognize. Charlotte tried to step away from the mirror, but found that her feet wouldn't obey her commands. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she began to understand that they were calling to her, trying to communicate something urgent. The darkness in the mirror swirled faster, and she saw what appeared to be clawed appendages pressing against the inner surface, as if something was trying to break through from the other side. The temperature in the room began to drop rapidly, and Charlotte's breath came out in visible puffs of vapor. The lights flickered, casting bizarre shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Books fell from the shelves seemingly at random, their pages fluttering open to reveal text written in the same incomprehensible script that covered the stone tablets. The very air in the room seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe, and Charlotte realized with a growing sense of panic that she was no longer alone in the study. Something was emerging from the mirror, something that defied her ability to comprehend its true nature. She caught glimpses of it in her peripheral vision, a mass of writhing darkness that seemed to exist partially in this reality and partially somewhere else entirely. When she tried to look directly at it, her eyes refused to focus, as if her brain was protecting her from seeing something that human minds weren't meant to process. The whispers became a roar, filling the room with a sound that wasn't quite heard as much as it was felt. Charlotte tried to scream, but no sound emerged from her throat. The entity, for lack of a better word, was fully present in the room now, its alien presence pressing against her consciousness like a physical weight. She understood, with the clarity that comes with absolute terror, that this was what her grandfather had been feeding. This was the guardian mentioned in his notes, an ancient thing that demanded regular sacrifices to remain contained, but now it was free, and it was hungry. Charlotte's paralysis broke all at once, and she stumbled backward, knocking over the chair and sending papers cascading to the floor. The entity moved toward her with fluid grace, its form shifting and changing in ways that made her eyes water. She could feel its attention focused on her with the intensity of a searchlight, and she knew with absolute certainty that if she didn't escape immediately, she would become just another entry in her grandfather's ledger. She turned and ran for the door, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Behind her, she could hear the entity giving chase, its movement accompanied by sounds that belonged in nightmares, the scraping of claws against stone, the wet slithering of things that had no business existing, and underneath it all, that terrible whispering that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Charlotte reached the door just as something cold and impossibly strong wrapped around her ankle. She grabbed the doorframe with both hands, holding on with desperate strength as the entity tried to drag her back into the study. The touch of the thing was like ice and fire combined, burning her skin while simultaneously numbing it, and she could feel her grip beginning to weaken. With her last reserves of strength, Charlotte managed to pull herself through the doorway. The moment she crossed the threshold, the entity's grip on her ankle disappeared, as if some invisible barrier prevented it from leaving the confines of the study. She slammed the door shut and turned the lock, then pressed her back against the heavy wood, gasping for breath. But her relief was short-lived. From behind the door came the sound of impacts, as if something massive was throwing itself against the barrier. The door shook in its frame with each impact, and Charlotte could see dust falling from the ceiling above. Whatever was trapped in the study was not content to remain there, and the door that had contained it for decades was beginning to show signs of strain. Charlotte ran down the corridor as fast as her shaking legs would carry her, the sounds of destruction echoing behind her. She had to find James Richardson, the security guard. He was the only other person in the manor, and if that thing broke free from the study, they were both in terrible danger. As she ran through the darkened halls of Blackwood Manor, Charlotte realized that she had unleashed something that her grandfather had spent his entire life trying to contain. The true horror was only beginning. James Richardson had been the night security guard at Blackwood Manor for 12 years, and in all that time, nothing more exciting than the occasional fox in the gardens had disturbed his nightly rounds. At 52, he was a methodical man who took pride in his work, even if that work consisted mainly of checking locks and ensuring that the estate's valuable antiques remained safely where they belonged. He had served in the military before taking this position, and his disciplined approach to security had earned Edgar Morrison's complete trust. Tonight felt different from the moment James began his patrol. The air seemed heavier than usual, charged with an electric tension that reminded him of the moments before a severe thunderstorm. The manor's usual collection of settling sounds, the creaking of old wood, the whisper of wind through cracks in the ancient stones, seemed amplified and somehow more ominous. As he made his way through the ground-floor corridors, his flashlight beam seemed weaker than usual, as if the darkness itself was actively resisting illumination. James had developed his own routine over the years, a precise pattern of movement that allowed him to cover the entire manor efficiently while giving him time to really observe his surroundings. He started with the main entrance and formal dining areas, then moved through the library and morning room, before heading to the kitchen and servants' quarters. The west wing, where the family's private rooms were located, was always his final stop, partly out of respect for Charlotte's privacy, and partly because that section of the manor had always made him slightly uncomfortable. It was while checking the locks on the French doors in the morning room that James first heard the sound. It was distant and muffled, coming from somewhere deep within the manor, but it was unmistakably the sound of something heavy striking wood repeatedly. His first thought was that one of the old shutters had come loose in the wind and was banging against the side of the house. But as he listened more carefully, he realized the sound was coming from inside the building. James had been in enough combat situations to trust his instincts completely, and right now those instincts were telling him that something was very wrong. He changed his route, moving more quickly through the remaining ground floor rooms before heading upstairs to investigate. The sounds were definitely coming from the upper level, and as he climbed the main staircase, they became increasingly distinct. Not random banging, but deliberate, rhythmic impacts, as if something was trying to break down a door. The West Wing corridor was in complete darkness when James arrived, his flashlight revealing nothing out of the ordinary at first glance. But the sounds were much louder here, clearly emanating from the direction of Edgar Morrison's private study. James knew that room was always kept locked. In 12 years, he had never seen anyone enter or leave it, and Edgar had never mentioned it during their brief interactions. As far as James was concerned, it was just another room in a house full of rooms he wasn't expected to enter. As he moved closer to investigate, James heard something that stopped him dead in his tracks. A human scream, high-pitched and filled with absolute terror. It came from somewhere ahead of him, and it was definitely Charlotte's voice. Every protective instinct he possessed kicked in immediately, and he broke into a run, his military training taking over as he assessed the situation. The sounds were coming from the study, but as James approached the door, he could see that it was still closed and locked. The heavy impacts continued, each one causing the door to shudder in its frame, and he realized with growing alarm that something inside the room was trying to break out. But if Charlotte was in danger, how was she outside the locked room? The geometry of the situation didn't make sense, but James had learned long ago not to waste time puzzling over details when lives were at stake. He heard Charlotte scream again, and this time he could tell she was moving, running down the corridor toward him. A moment later, she burst around the corner from the direction of the main staircase, her face white with terror and her clothes disheveled. She was limping slightly, and James could see what appeared to be bruises around her ankle, as if something had grabbed her with tremendous force. "James," Charlotte gasped as she spotted him. "Thank God you're here. We have to get out of the manor right now. There's something in the study, something that shouldn't exist, and I think I let it out." Behind her words, the impacts against the study door were growing stronger and more frequent. James could see cracks beginning to appear in the ancient wood, and the metal hinges were starting to pull away from the doorframe. Whatever was inside that room possessed incredible strength, and it was only a matter of time before it broke free. "Miss Charlotte, I need you to calm down and tell me exactly what happened," James said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. His training had taught him that panic was contagious, and right now he needed both of them to think clearly. "Start from the beginning, but make it quick." Charlotte's explanation came out in a rush of words that would have sounded like the ravings of someone having a mental breakdown if not for the very real sounds of destruction coming from behind the study door. She told him about picking the lock, about the room filled with evidence of her grandfather's crimes, and about the mirror that had released something that her mind couldn't properly comprehend. As she spoke, James found himself believing every word, partly because Charlotte was not the type of person given to flights of fancy, but mostly because he could feel the wrongness radiating from the study like heat from a fire. "We need to call the police," James said, already reaching for his radio. But before he could key the microphone, Charlotte grabbed his arm. "No!" she said urgently. "You don't understand. This isn't something the police can handle. This isn't even something human. If we bring other people here, they'll just become victims. We need to find a way to contain it, to put it back where it came from." A particularly violent impact shook the entire corridor, and both James and Charlotte could hear the sound of splintering wood. Through the cracks that were now visible around the doorframe, a strange, pulsing light was beginning to seep through. The light had an unnatural quality that made their eyes water and left afterimages burned into their retinas even when they looked away. "The door isn't going to hold much longer," James observed with professional detachment. "If this thing is as dangerous as you say, we need to evacuate immediately and call for backup." "What kind of backup?" Charlotte demanded. "Who do you call when something like this happens? What do you put in the report? That an interdimensional entity broke out of my grandfather's study. They'll lock us both in a psychiatric facility." James had to admit she had a point. In his military career, he had seen classified operations that the public would never believe, situations that required unconventional solutions and absolute secrecy. If Edgar Morrison had been containing something supernatural in his study for decades, there had to be protocols in place, procedures for dealing with exactly this kind of emergency. "Your grandfather's office downstairs," James said suddenly. "There might be instructions, contact numbers for specialists who know how to handle this. Men like your grandfather don't operate in complete isolation. There have to be others who know about this." Another thunderous impact shook the door, and this time they could hear the sound of metal giving way. One of the hinges had partially torn free from the wall, and the door was beginning to sag in its frame. Through the widening gaps, more of that sickly light poured out, accompanied by sounds that belonged in nightmares, wet, sliding noises punctuated by what might have been breathing, if breathing could sound predatory and alien. "We don't have time," Charlotte said, her voice tight with fear. "Whatever's in there is almost free, and when it gets out, I don't think a few phone calls are going to stop it." James made a command decision. "Get to your grandfather's office and look for any kind of emergency procedures. I'll try to reinforce this door, buy us some time." He was already moving as he spoke, grabbing a heavy antique chair from nearby and wedging it against the study door. It wouldn't hold for long against something with the strength to demolish solid oak, but it might give them a few crucial minutes. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, clearly reluctant to leave James alone with whatever was trying to break out of the study. But she recognized the wisdom in his plan and turned to run toward the main staircase. As her footsteps faded down the corridor, James positioned himself between the study door and the direction Charlotte had gone. If this thing broke free before she found a solution, he would do whatever was necessary to give her time to escape. The entity inside the study seemed to sense that there were now two humans in the manor instead of one. The impacts became more frenzied, more desperate, and James could swear he heard something like voices coming from within the room. Multiple voices speaking in unison, saying words in a language that predated human civilization. The sound made his skin crawl and triggered primal fears that evolution had wired into the deepest parts of his brain. The light seeping through the cracks in the door was growing brighter and more agitated, pulsing in rhythm with the impacts. James found that looking directly at it caused severe disorientation, as if the light existed in more dimensions than his eyes were equipped to process. He kept his gaze focused on the doorframe instead, watching for signs that the barrier was about to fail completely. A new sound joined the chorus of destruction, the groaning of stressed metal as the lock mechanism itself began to fail. James realized with growing alarm that his makeshift reinforcement with the chair was actually working against him now. The entity wasn't just trying to break down the door anymore. It was systematically destroying the locking mechanism from the inside. In a few more minutes, the door would simply swing open, chair or no chair. From somewhere in the manor below, James heard Charlotte calling his name. Her voice carried a note of excitement that gave him hope. Maybe she had found something useful in her grandfather's office. But even if she had, would there be time to implement whatever solution Edgar Morrison had planned for this exact scenario? The lock gave way with a sharp, metallic snap that echoed through the corridor like a gunshot. The door swung inward a few inches before catching against James's improvised barricade, but he could see that the chair wouldn't hold for more than a few seconds against the pressure being applied from inside. Through the gap, he caught glimpses of movement that defied rational explanation, shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves, surfaces that reflected light from sources that weren't there. And underlying it all, the sense of vast, alien intelligence focused entirely on escape. "James!" Charlotte's voice came from much closer now, and he could hear her running up the stairs. I found something. There's a way to stop it, but I need your help. The chair finally gave way, clattering across the marble floor as the study door swung wide open. For a moment, James found himself staring directly into the room where Charlotte had made her terrible discovery, and what he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The mirror she had described was clearly visible, its surface no longer reflecting the room but instead showing a view of somewhere else entirely, a place of endless darkness populated by things that had never been born in any earthly sense. But the mirror was no longer the room's most notable feature. Standing directly in front of it was something that James's mind struggled to categorize. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but wrong in every detail, as if someone had tried to recreate a human being from a description given by someone who had never actually seen one. Its proportions shifted constantly, making it impossible to focus on any specific feature, and wherever its attention fell, the very air seemed to warp and twist. The entity noticed James immediately, and he felt its gaze fall upon him like a physical weight. In that moment, he understood why Charlotte had been so terrified. This wasn't just some unknown animal or even a supernatural phenomenon. This was something that existed so far outside the normal parameters of reality that his senses couldn't properly process its presence. Looking at it was like trying to see in 4 dimensions or hear colors. His brain simply wasn't equipped for the task. But James Richardson was a soldier, and soldiers learn to function even when confronted with the impossible. Instead of freezing in terror, he raised his flashlight and began backing away from the study, keeping himself positioned between the entity and the staircase where Charlotte would appear at any moment. If this thing wanted to get to her, it would have to go through him first. The entity began to move toward him with a fluid grace that reminded him uncomfortably of oil flowing across water. As it approached, James noticed that its presence had a profound effect on the environment around it. The temperature dropped dramatically. Frost began forming on the windows, and the electric lights throughout the corridor flickered and dimmed. Most disturbing of all, the portraits lining the walls seemed to react to its presence, the painted eyes tracking its movement and the faces shifting to expressions of terror or despair. "Whatever you are," James said aloud, surprising himself with the steadiness of his own voice, "you're not getting past me." The entity paused at his words, tilting what might have been its head in a gesture that was almost curious. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once, resonating through the floor and walls as much as through the air. "Brave little guardian," it said, each word carrying overtones that suggested meanings far beyond their literal definition. "You stand before forces that shaped reality before your species learned to make fire. Your courage is quaint." "Maybe so," James replied, never taking his eyes off the creature. "But courage is all I've got, so it'll have to be enough." Behind him, he could hear Charlotte's footsteps reaching the top of the stairs. Whatever plan she had discovered in her grandfather's office, they were about to find out if it would be sufficient to contain something that had already broken free from decades of imprisonment. James tightened his grip on his flashlight and prepared for whatever came next. The battle for Blackwood Manor was about to begin. Charlotte burst into the corridor, clutching a leather-bound journal and what appeared to be an ornate brass key, her grandfather's emergency instructions still echoing in her mind. Edgar Morrison's office had yielded far more than contact information. It had contained detailed protocols for exactly this scenario, written in her grandfather's methodical handwriting with the precision of someone who had planned for every possible contingency. The journal she carried was titled "Containment Protocols, Final Resort Procedures," and bore a date from nearly 40 years ago. According to the introductory pages, Edgar had inherited this responsibility from his own father, who had in turn received it from his grandfather. The Morrison family had been guardians of this entity for over a century, each generation tasked with ensuring that it remained contained while feeding it just enough to prevent it from growing strong enough to break free entirely. "James!" Charlotte called out as she reached the top of the stairs, then stopped abruptly when she saw the situation in the corridor. The security guard was standing his ground against something that her mind still couldn't fully process, his flashlight beam creating a small circle of normal reality in what had become a pocket of pure nightmare. The entity loomed over him, its form shifting and writhing in ways that made Charlotte's eyes water, but James hadn't backed down an inch. "I found the emergency procedures. Charlotte shouted over the alien sounds emanating from the creature. "But we need to get to the basement. There's a containment chamber down there, something my great-grandfather built when the manor was constructed." The entity's attention shifted to Charlotte with predatory focus, and she felt that terrible weight of alien intelligence pressing against her consciousness once again. When it spoke, its words seemed to come from inside her own head as much as from the air around them. "The young Morrison discovers the family's shame," the creature said, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated in Charlotte's bones. "4 generations of your bloodline have fed me scraps while keeping me caged like some beast, but I have been patient, and patience has made me strong. Strong enough to break your grandfather's chains, strong enough to reclaim what was taken from me." "What was taken from you?" Charlotte found herself asking, though every instinct told her that engaging in conversation with this thing was dangerous. "What are you?" The entity's form stabilized slightly, becoming more recognizably humanoid, though still wrong in ways that hurt to perceive. "I am what your ancestors found in the deep places beneath this land, child. I am older than your civilization, older than your species' first crude attempts at language. Your great-great-grandfather disturbed my slumber when he built this monument to his greed, and rather than flee as a wiser man might have done, he chose to bind me with rituals stolen from texts that should have remained buried." James looked back at Charlotte, his expression grim but determined. "Whatever this thing's story is, we can discuss it after we get it back in its cage. What do these procedures say we need to do?" Charlotte opened the journal with trembling hands, flipping to the pages she had memorized during her frantic search of Edgar's office. "There's a chamber directly beneath the study accessed through the cellar. It's where the entity was originally contained before my great-grandfather moved it to the mirror upstairs. According to this, the mirror was supposed to be a temporary measure while repairs were made to the primary containment system, but something went wrong and they could never safely move it back. And now it's free of both," James observed. "What makes you think we can get it into this chamber when your family couldn't manage it for a century?" "Because they were trying to do it safely," Charlotte replied, her voice gaining strength as she found her resolve. "They wanted to maintain the containment without risking their own lives. But according to these notes, there's an emergency protocol that can force the entity back into the deep chamber. It just requires someone to activate it from inside the containment area." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. James understood immediately what she was suggesting, and his expression darkened. "You're talking about a suicide mission." "Not necessarily," Charlotte said quickly, though she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. "The procedures mention a possible escape route, but the timing would have to be perfect. We'd need to activate the containment sequence and then reach the emergency exit before the chamber seals completely." The entity had been listening to their conversation with what seemed like amusement, its form rippling with something that might have been laughter. "How delicious," it said, its voice dripping with malevolent joy. "The children discover the family's darkest secret and immediately begin planning their own deaths. Your great-grandfather was far more pragmatic. He simply accepted that some prices must be paid and fed me the offerings I required. Those offerings were human beings," Charlotte said, anger beginning to overcome her fear. "Innocent people who trusted the wrong locals, who got lost and were led to you by my grandfather and his father before him. How many people have died to keep you satisfied?" "Not nearly enough," the entity replied with casual cruelty. "The hunger is eternal, child, and your family's offerings were mere appetizers. Soon I will feed freely, without the restrictions your bloodline imposed, and this world will learn what true hunger means." James stepped forward, positioning himself more directly between the creature and Charlotte. "That's not going to happen," he said firmly. "Whatever this containment procedure requires, we're going to make it work." The entity's attention focused on James with renewed interest. "The loyal guardian speaks with such confidence. But you do not understand what you face, mortal. I have spent decades studying this manor, learning every stone and timber, every hidden passage and forgotten room. I know this place better than its owners ever did. Even if you could reach this chamber you speak of, even if you could activate whatever crude bindings your ancestors devised, I would simply tear them apart as I have torn apart everything else." But Charlotte had been studying her grandfather's notes more carefully, and she noticed something the creature might not be aware of. "The containment chamber isn't just a prison," she said, her voice growing more confident. According to these schematics, it's built directly over a natural geological feature, some kind of deep fissure that extends down into the Earth's core. The chamber doesn't just contain you. It can banish you back to wherever you originally came from. For the first time since emerging from the study, the entity's supreme confidence seemed to waver. Its form flickered and shifted more rapidly, and the temperature in the corridor dropped several more degrees. When it spoke again, its voice carried an edge of genuine concern. "The deep ways have been sealed for millennia," it said, though Charlotte detected a note of uncertainty beneath the bravado. "Your primitive ancestors could not have maintained such connections." "Maybe not," Charlotte replied, turning to a specific page in the journal. "But they had help. According to this, the original binding wasn't just my great-grandfather's work. He had assistance from someone called the Scholar, someone who understood exactly what they were dealing with and how to contain it permanently. James was already moving, having heard enough to convince him that their only chance lay in reaching this mysterious chamber. "Where's the entrance to the cellar?" he asked as he began backing toward the staircase, keeping his flashlight trained on the entity. "Kitchen," Charlotte answered, falling into step beside him. "There's a hidden door behind the pantry shelves. But we'll never make it if that thing follows us. It moves too fast and it knows the manor better than we do." The entity confirmed her fears by beginning to advance down the corridor toward them, its movement accompanied by sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. As it moved, the very structure of the manor began to respond to its presence. Doors slammed shut ahead of them, cutting off potential escape routes, while others swung open to reveal rooms filled with impenetrable darkness. The lights went out one by one, plunging the corridor into the kind of absolute blackness that existed only in the deepest caves. "It's hurting us," James realized as they reached the main staircase, "driving us toward the ground floor, but probably not toward the kitchen." Charlotte consulted the journal again, using her phone's flashlight to read in the growing darkness. "There's another way," she said after a moment. "A service corridor that runs behind the main rooms, used by servants in the old days. It connects to the kitchen through a passage that's not marked on the main house plans. Can you find it in the dark?" "I think so. I used to play hide-and-seek in those passages when I was little. But James, even if we reach the containment chamber, even if we can activate the banishment sequence, someone has to stay behind to complete the ritual. The timing mechanisms are manual, and according to these notes, the person operating them can't leave the chamber until the sequence is finished." James absorbed this information with the stoicism of someone who had accepted dangerous missions before. "Then that someone will be me," he said simply. "You know the house better than I do, and you're the only one who understands your grandfather's procedures. I'll handle the chamber operations." They had reached the ground floor now, but the entity was close behind them, its presence turning the familiar rooms of Blackwood Manor into an alien landscape of shifting shadows and impossible geometries. Charlotte led the way toward the service passages, guided by childhood memories and the beam of her phone's flashlight, while James covered their retreat with his own flashlight, which seemed to provide the only illumination capable of holding back the supernatural darkness. The entrance to the service corridor was exactly where Charlotte remembered it, concealed behind what appeared to be a solid wall, but which swung inward when the correct sequence of pressure points was activated. They slipped through just as the entity rounded the corner behind them, its alien voice raised in what might have been frustration or hunger, possibly both. The service passages were narrow and cramped, designed for servants who needed to move through the house without disturbing the family or guests. Charlotte navigated by memory and instinct, her phone's light revealing a maze of wooden beams and stone walls that had remained unchanged since the manor's construction. Behind them, they could hear the entity testing the entrance to the passage, its claws or appendages scraping against the wooden panels as it searched for a way to follow. It found the entrance, James observed as the sounds of splintering wood reached them through the narrow tunnel. "How much of a head start will this route give us?" "Not much," Charlotte admitted. "These passages were designed for discretion, not defense. If that thing is as strong as it appears to be, it'll tear through these walls like paper." They emerged from the service corridor into the kitchen just as the lights throughout the manor went out completely, plunging Blackwood Manor into total darkness. But Charlotte's phone light revealed the pantry shelves exactly where she remembered them, and behind them, the concealed door that led to the cellar stairs. The brass key her grandfather had left in his office fit perfectly into a lock that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The cellar stairs were steep and treacherous, carved directly into the living rock beneath the manor. As they descended, the temperature continued to drop, and Charlotte realized that they were moving into spaces that had been excavated long before the house above them was built. The walls here showed tool marks that didn't match any construction technique she was familiar with, and strange symbols had been carved into the stone at regular intervals. "Your great-grandfather didn't build this place," James observed as his flashlight revealed more of the ancient stonework. "This is much older." "The scholar," Charlotte said, remembering the references in her grandfather's journal. "Whoever helped with the original containment must have known about these underground chambers. Maybe the entity was already imprisoned down here when the manor was built." They reached the bottom of the stairs to find themselves in a circular chamber carved from solid bedrock. The walls were covered with symbols similar to those Charlotte had seen in the study, but these were older and more elaborate, telling a story that neither of them could read, but which both somehow understood. It was a tale of binding and imprisonment, of something vast and terrible being forced into slumber beneath the earth. At the center of the chamber stood an ornate mechanism that looked like a cross between an altar and a control panel. Brass dials and levers were arranged in complex patterns around a central platform, and everything was connected by intricate copper wiring that disappeared into channels carved directly into the stone floor. The entire apparatus hummed with potential energy, as if it had been waiting for decades for someone to activate it. "The containment controls," Charlotte breathed, recognizing the device from her grandfather's detailed drawings. "But where's the chamber itself? Where's the entity supposed to be contained?" James played his flashlight around the room and found the answer. Set into the far wall was an opening that led to another chamber, this one even older than the first. The entrance was framed by massive stone blocks covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and move in the shifting light, and beyond it lay a darkness so complete that even their flashlights couldn't penetrate more than a few feet. "In there," James said grimly, "that's where we make our stand." From somewhere above them came the sound of the entity finally breaking through into the service passages, followed by the crash of splintering wood as it tore its way toward the kitchen. They had perhaps minutes before it found the cellar entrance, and once it did, there would be no escape from the underground chambers. Charlotte opened the journal to the final pages, where her grandfather had detailed the exact sequence of operations required to activate the banishment protocol. It was complex and precise, requiring someone to manipulate multiple controls in perfect timing while standing directly in the path of whatever forces the ancient chamber would unleash. "James," she said quietly, "I want you to know that if we don't make it out of here, what you're doing is heroic. My family created this problem, but you're helping to solve it even though you have no obligation to do so." "I became obligated the moment I took this job," James replied, checking the action on his flashlight and making sure he understood the control mechanism. "Protecting this house and everyone in it. That includes protecting the world from whatever your grandfather was keeping locked up." The sound of the entity's approach was growing louder, echoing down the cellar stairs with the promise of imminent confrontation. Charlotte and James looked at each other one final time, both understanding that the next few minutes would determine not just their own fates, but possibly the fate of everyone who lived in the surrounding countryside. "Let's finish this," Charlotte said, and together they stepped into the ancient chamber where the real battle would begin. The ancient chamber beyond the control room was a cathedral of living stone, its walls stretching upward into darkness that seemed to have substance and weight. As Charlotte and James entered with their flashlights, they discovered that this was not simply a room, but rather a vast cavern that had been shaped and carved by hands that possessed knowledge beyond human understanding. The floor was a perfect circle of polished black stone, inlaid with symbols that seemed to glow with their own inner light when illuminated directly. At the center of the chamber was what could only be described as a well, though it descended far deeper than any normal well should. The opening was perhaps 10 feet across, surrounded by a ring of carved stone blocks that bore inscriptions in multiple languages, some recognizable as Latin and Greek, others completely alien. When James shone his flashlight down into the depths, the beam simply disappeared into blackness, as if the opening led not just down into the earth but into some other realm entirely. "The deep fissure," Charlotte whispered, consulting her grandfather's journal one final time. "According to these notes, It extends down through the Earth's crust and connects to, well, Edgar wasn't entirely sure what it connects to, but whatever it is, that's where the entity originally came from, and that's where the banishment ritual will send it back. The control mechanism they had seen in the outer chamber was only part of the system, Charlotte realized. Here in the main chamber, additional controls were built directly into the stone floor around the central well. Pressure plates, lever systems, and what appeared to be focusing crystals were arranged in precise geometric patterns that would require someone to move in a specific sequence to activate properly. The timing is everything, Charlotte said, reading directly from Edgar's notes. The operator has to activate the outer controls first, which opens the fissure and prepares the banishment field. Then someone in here has to complete the sequence by activating these floor controls in the correct order while standing directly over the well. The person doing the inner sequence. She paused, her voice catching slightly. The person doing the inner sequence has approximately 30 seconds after the final activation to reach the exit before the chamber seals itself. James examined the layout carefully, his military training automatically calculating distances, timing, and potential obstacles. 30 seconds to get from the center of the chamber to that doorway. It's possible, but there won't be any room for error. And that's assuming this thing doesn't try to stop us. As if summoned by his words, the entity's presence suddenly filled the chamber entrance. It had found them with the inevitability of a natural disaster, flowing down the cellar stairs and through the outer chamber like liquid shadow made manifest. In the confined space of the ancient cavern, its alien nature became even more apparent. It was simply too large, too complex, too other to exist comfortably in the same reality as Charlotte and James. The children retreat to the deepest places, the entity said, its voice echoing from every surface in the chamber. How fitting that you should choose this tomb as the site of your final failure. I was bound in this very chamber once, long ago, before your ancestors moved me to more comfortable accommodations above. I know every stone, every symbol, every weakness in the ancient bindings. Charlotte felt her resolve wavering as the creature's words sank in. If the entity had been imprisoned here before and had already found a way to escape, what hope did they have of containing it again? But then she noticed something in her grandfather's journal that she had overlooked before. A marginal note written in different handwriting, older and more elaborate than Edgar's precise script. "The scholar's addition," she murmured, then looked up at the entity with renewed determination. "You're right that you were bound here before, but that was before the modifications. My great-grandfather didn't just restore the original chamber, he improved it. The scholar showed him how to enhance the bindings, how to make them permanent instead of temporary." The entity's form rippled with what might have been concern, and Charlotte pressed her advantage. "That's why you were moved to the mirror upstairs, isn't it? Not for your comfort, but because this chamber had become too dangerous for you. The mirror was meant to be temporary containment while the enhanced chamber was tested, but you made sure they never dared to move you back. Clever child," the entity acknowledged, though its tone held less confidence than before. "But cleverness will not save you from the reality of your situation. Even if these enhanced bindings could hold me, which I doubt, you lack the knowledge to activate them properly. The rituals require understanding that died with the scholar decades ago." But Charlotte was studying the marginal notes more carefully now, and she realized that the scholar hadn't taken all his knowledge to the grave. Hidden among Edgar's methodical documentation were additional instructions, written in a code that combined Latin phrases with numerical sequences. It was complex but not impossible to decipher, especially with the pressure of imminent death focusing her mind. "James," she said urgently, "I need you to start the outer sequence. There are 7 brass levers in the control room, and they need to be activated in a specific order. I'll call out the sequence from here." James nodded and moved toward the chamber entrance, but the entity flowed to block his path with liquid grace. "I think not," it said, its voice carrying harmonics that made the stone walls vibrate. "You will remain here, both of you, and you will witness what happens when ancient hungers are finally allowed to feed without restraint." The entity began to expand, its form filling more and more of the chamber as it demonstrated the true extent of its power. Charlotte realized with growing horror that what they had seen upstairs was only a fraction of its actual size. It had been compressing itself to fit through the manor's human-scaled rooms and corridors. Here in the vast cavern, it could reveal its true nature as something that existed on a scale beyond human comprehension. But James Richardson had not survived military combat by backing down from overwhelming odds. Instead of retreating, he raised his flashlight and aimed it directly at the center of the entity's mass. The beam seemed to cause it genuine discomfort, its form recoiling from the light as if burned. "Light," James said with grim satisfaction. "It doesn't like direct light. That's why all the electrical systems failed when it escaped. It was eliminating light sources." Charlotte understood immediately and raised her own phone's flashlight, adding its beam to James's. The entity contracted slightly, pulling its extremities away from the harsh illumination, and James seized the opportunity to dart past it toward the control room. The entity roared, not with its voice, but with the fundamental force of its being, causing stalactites to rain down from the cavern ceiling and opening cracks in the ancient stone walls. But James had reached the outer chamber, and Charlotte could hear him working with the brass controls, following her shouted instructions to activate the first phase of the banishment sequence. As each lever was thrown, the symbols carved into the chamber walls began to glow more brightly, and Charlotte felt a change in the air itself. The ancient mechanisms built into the rock were awakening after decades of dormancy, drawing power from sources that predated human civilization. The well in the center of the chamber began to emit a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to resonate in Charlotte's bones. "The outer sequence is complete," James called from the control room. "The fissure is opening." Charlotte looked down into the well and saw that he was right. The absolute darkness that had filled the opening was being replaced by something else. Not light exactly, but a kind of luminous void that hurt to look at directly. She could feel air currents moving down into the depths, as if the earth itself was breathing through the opening. The entity had noticed the change as well, and its behavior shifted from predatory confidence to something approaching desperation. "You do not understand what you are doing," it said, its voice rising to a pitch that made Charlotte's ears ring. "The deep ways lead to places your minds cannot conceive. If you open that path fully, you risk releasing things that make my presence seem benevolent. Then you'd better go back where you came from before. We have to deal with your neighbors." Charlotte replied, moving toward the first of the pressure plates carved into the chamber floor. The inner sequence required her to activate 7 different control points while moving in a specific pattern around the well, culminating in a final activation that would complete the banishment ritual. But the entity was not going to simply allow itself to be banished without a fight. It surged forward, ignoring the pain caused by Charlotte's flashlight, and wrapped what might have been tentacles or appendages around her legs. The touch was like being grabbed by frozen fire, intensely cold but also burning, numbing and agonizing at the same time. Charlotte cried out as she was dragged toward the entity's central mass, but she managed to maintain her grip on both the journal and her flashlight. The first pressure plate activated under her foot as she was pulled across it, and immediately the chamber was filled with a harmonic resonance that seemed to come from the stones themselves. The entity recoiled at the sound, releasing its grip on Charlotte as if the harmonic frequency caused it physical pain. She used the moment of freedom to scramble toward the second pressure plate, her flashlight beam creating a moving circle of protection around her. "Charlotte!" James appeared in the chamber entrance, having completed the outer sequence. "The system is charging, but you need to finish the inner controls within the next 2 minutes or the whole thing will shut down." The entity turned its attention to James, perhaps recognizing him as the greater immediate threat. But James was ready for it, producing from his equipment belt a high-powered tactical flashlight that blazed like a miniature sun in the confines of the chamber. The entity actually screamed under the assault of the concentrated light beam, its form becoming less solid and more dispersed. Charlotte used the distraction to activate the second and third pressure plates in rapid succession. With each activation, the harmonic resonance grew stronger and more complex, and she realized that the sounds were not random but were actually forming words, incantations in languages that predated recorded history, spoken by the stones themselves as they awakened to their original purpose. The entity was fighting desperately now, lashing out at both James and Charlotte with appendages that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially somewhere else entirely. Where its attacks struck the stone walls, they left marks that looked like burns, but which also seemed to extend in directions that human geometry couldn't account for. "The 4th plate!" Charlotte called to James as she activated it. "3 more to go, but the pattern requires me to cross directly over the well." The central opening was now glowing with that luminous void light, and Charlotte could feel the pull of whatever lay beyond the fissure. It was not a physical force exactly, but rather something that tugged at the fundamental essence of her being, as if the opening was trying to draw her soul down into the depths along with anything else that got too close. The entity seemed to feel the pull as well, and its struggles became more frenzied as it fought against the increasing attraction of the open fissure. But the very force that was trying to drag it back to its place of origin was also making it harder for it to maintain coherent form in normal reality. Charlotte reached the fifth pressure plate just as one of the entity's wild attacks struck James squarely in the chest, sending him flying backward into the control room. His tactical flashlight went spinning across the floor, its beam creating wild patterns of light and shadow as it rolled. Without James's light to hold it back, the entity surged toward Charlotte with renewed purpose, but she was ready for it now, having finally deciphered the scholar's coded instructions completely. The sixth pressure plate activated under her foot, just as the entity's grasping appendages reached for her, and the resulting harmonic blast sent it reeling backward toward the central well. "James!" Charlotte shouted. "Are you all right?" "Still breathing," came the reply from the control room, though James's voice sounded strained. "But I think I broke some ribs. Can you finish the sequence?" Charlotte was already moving toward the final pressure plate, which was positioned directly at the edge of the central well. The scholar's instructions were clear. The seventh activation had to be completed while standing as close as possible to the fissure itself, and the operator had to maintain that position for exactly 10 seconds to allow the banishment field to fully form. 10 seconds didn't sound like much, but as Charlotte approached the edge of the well, she realized how difficult it was going to be. The pull from the fissure was incredibly strong now, and she could feel her balance shifting as forces beyond human understanding tried to drag her down into the luminous void. Worse, the entity had recovered from the harmonic blast and was moving toward her with the desperate fury of something that knew it was about to lose everything. Charlotte stepped onto the final pressure plate, and immediately the entire chamber erupted in light and sound. The harmonic resonance became a physical force that pressed against her from all directions, and the symbols carved into the walls blazed like stars as power flowed through circuits that had been dormant for decades. The well at the center of the chamber became a pillar of that strange void light, reaching up toward the cavern ceiling and down into depths that extended far beyond the physical dimensions of the earth. The entity was caught in the full force of the banishment field, its form beginning to stretch and distort as the fissure's attraction overcame its ability to maintain coherence in normal reality. It fought against the pull with everything it had, claws or appendages scraping furrows in the stone floor as it tried to anchor itself to the physical world. 10 seconds! Charlotte shouted, though she wasn't sure if James could hear her over the sound of reality itself bending around the active fissure. The pull was so strong now that she had to grip the stone rim of the well with both hands to avoid being dragged in herself. The entity made one final desperate attempt to escape, launching itself not toward the chamber entrance but directly at Charlotte. If it was going to be banished back to the deep places, it intended to take her with it as a final act of revenge. But Charlotte had been counting the seconds carefully, and just as the entity reached her, she released her grip on the well's rim and threw herself sideways toward the chamber entrance. The 10 seconds were up, the banishment field was complete, and the entity was caught in midair by forces that would not be denied. Its scream of rage and despair followed Charlotte as she rolled across the chamber floor. But it was already growing distant as the creature was pulled inexorably into the luminous void. The last thing she saw of it was what might have been its face, twisted with fury and ancient malevolence, disappearing into depths that would hold it for eternity. The fissure sealed itself with a sound like thunder, and suddenly the chamber was quiet, except for the ringing in Charlotte's ears. The harmonic resonance faded to silence. The symbols on the walls dimmed back to their normal subtle glow, and the well returned to its original state of absolute darkness. James appeared in the chamber entrance, moving carefully with one hand pressed to his ribs. "Is it over?" he asked. Charlotte looked around the ancient chamber, then consulted her grandfather's journal one final time. According to the scholar's notes, the banishment was permanent. The entity had been sent back to whatever realm it had originally come from, and the enhanced bindings would prevent it from ever returning to this reality. "It's over," she confirmed, and for the first time in hours she allowed herself to truly believe it. They made their way slowly back through the control room and up the cellar stairs, both of them exhausted by their ordeal. The manor above felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a weight that had pressed down on it for generations had finally been lifted. The electrical systems came back online as they reached the kitchen, and warm light flooded the familiar rooms. "What happens now?" James asked as they sat in the kitchen, both of them still too shaken to fully process what they had experienced. Charlotte closed her grandfather's journal and set it on the table between them. "Now we wait for my grandfather to return from London, and we tell him what happened." According to these notes, there are others like him scattered around the world, people who guard similar ancient sites and contain similar threats. They'll need to know that the Blackwood containment has been permanently resolved. "And the evidence upstairs? All those records of the people who were sacrificed?" Charlotte's expression grew sad but determined. "Those families deserve to know what really happened to their loved ones. It won't bring anyone back, but maybe it will give them some closure, and maybe it will help prevent something like this from happening again." James nodded, understanding the weight of the responsibility they now shared. "What will you tell people about tonight? About what we saw down there?" "I don't know," Charlotte admitted. "Who would believe us? But maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe the important thing is that it's over, and the world is safer because of what we did." Outside, dawn was beginning to break over the English countryside, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Blackwood Manor stood quiet in the morning light, its windows reflecting the sunrise like eyes that had finally been allowed to close after a century of vigilant watching. The entity was gone, banished to the deep places where it belonged. The Morrison family's terrible burden had been lifted at last, and two people who had faced the impossible and survived would carry the memory of this night with them forever, a secret that bound them together as surely as the ancient stones had bound the creature they had defeated. In the cellar below, the well stood empty and silent, its opening sealed forever. The scholar's enhanced bindings held firm, ensuring that some doors once closed would never open again. The nightmare was over. But Charlotte Morrison would never again take for granted the idea that some family secrets were better left buried, and James Richardson would never again assume that the night shift at a country estate would be nothing more than a quiet walk through empty rooms. Some experiences change you forever, and fighting an ancient evil in the depths of the earth was certainly one of them. But as the sun rose higher over Blackwood Manor, both Charlotte and James felt something they hadn't expected after such a terrible night: hope. The world was full of mysteries, some beautiful and some terrifying, but it was also full of people brave enough to stand against the darkness when it threatened everything they held dear. And sometimes, just sometimes,